The story opens in the dimly lit, cavernous reading room of the Harmony Creek Library. Dust motes dance in the single beam of light from a boarded-up window. A small group of people, young and old, are scattered amongst the tables, their faces illuminated by the glow of a laptop. From a small speaker, the crackly, warm voice of a long-dead coal miner fills the space, telling a story of survival deep beneath the earth. A teenage girl, Maya, who weeks ago would have been spray-painting the walls, now sits utterly captivated. In the shadows by a far bookshelf, Liam, his hands still stained with grease, watches the scene, a fragile, unaccustomed flicker of hope warming his chest. He sees a retired teacher gently place a hand on the shoulder of a man weeping silently, recognizing the voice of his grandfather. This was more than just a building, it was becoming a sanctuary. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The journey to this fragile moment of grace began weeks earlier, not with hope, but with a quiet act of surrender. It started in Mayor Henderson's office, a space so aggressively modern and sterile, it felt like an architectural insult to the decaying town it governed. Everything was chrome and glass, reflecting a distorted, elongated version of Liam as he stood before the desk. The mayor, a man who mistook his expensive suit for a personality, had a large window that perfectly framed the sagging, derelict library across the street, presenting it like a macabre portrait of failure. Henderson, without making eye contact, slid a heavy, ornate iron key across his polished desk. The sound it made was a dull, final scrape. He explained the situation with the kind of bureaucratic detachment that could drain the life out of any subject. The library, he droned, was a condemned public nuisance, an insurance nightmare the town simply couldn't afford to demolish. His words were clipped, efficient, and utterly devoid of any sentiment for the building's history or what it once meant. "It's an eyesore, Liam," Henderson said, finally looking up. His gaze was dismissive, sweeping over Liam's worn work jacket and the ingrained grime on his knuckles. "The council's worried some kid will get hurt climbing on that disaster of a roof. You like to tinker, right? Go tinker there. All we ask is you keep the vandals and vagrants out. Do that and we won't ask what you're doing. Consider it your own private junkyard." Liam said nothing. He simply reached out and picked up the key. Its cold weight was a tangible burden in his palm, a familiar feeling. He was the town's designated problem solver for its dirty jobs. The grease-stained outcast you called when something was broken and not worth a professional's time. His silence was profound, a vacuum the mayor filled with his own assumptions of simple-minded agreement. But Liam's quiet was the quiet of a man who was observing, calculating, a man long used to being underestimated. He gave a short, sharp nod, the only reply necessary. As his fingers closed around the iron, a strange, dormant sense of ownership stirred within him. This wasn't just another broken engine or a clogged drain. It was the library, and now, in a way, it was his. He crossed the street, the key feeling heavier with each step. The grand oak doors of the Harmony Creek Library were scarred and peeling, but they held. The key grated in the lock, a sound of protest from years of disuse. The door swung inward on a groan, releasing a sigh of trapped, stale air. Liam stepped inside and began to diagnose the carcass. The main reading room was a cathedral of decay. The bowed roof sagged inward like an old, tired spine. The air was a thick, cloying cocktail of mildew, rotting paper, and the sharp ammonia tang of pigeon droppings. Water stains bloomed across the plaster walls like ghostly, spreading continents, mapping a geography of neglect. Entire shelves of books had collapsed into pulpy, unrecognizable masses, their words and worlds dissolving into a uniform brown sludge. Graffiti covered the walls in angry, vibrant scars, a testament to the building's more recent, uninvited patrons. Liam walked through the ruin with the detached professionalism of a seasoned mechanic. He wasn't seeing a lost sanctuary of knowledge. He was seeing structural failure, a series of cascading problems that needed to be addressed. He ran a calloused hand over the warped oak of a circulation desk. Its surface bubbled and split. He tested the sponginess of the floorboards near a leaking wall with the toe of his boot, feeling the give and calculating the extent of the rot beneath. He squinted up at the sagging ceiling joists, his mind already cataloging the broken bones of the building. As he stood in the center of the devastation, a brief, vivid memory ambushed him. He was a small, lonely boy of about 10, hiding in the history section with a thick, illustrated book on diesel engines. The library had been his only escape from a chaotic home life, a quiet harbor in a turbulent childhood. The memory, instead of being comforting, fueled a slow-burning anger deep in his gut. This wasn't just a building, it was a refuge, and the town had let it die. They had looked at this place, this haven, and seen nothing worth saving. The anger gave him focus. He returned to his garage, a place of methodical order, and gathered his tools and materials. He wasn't restoring, not yet. He was performing triage. He started with the roof, the source of the building's most grievous wounds. He climbed onto the treacherous, moss-slicked surface and began to methodically patch the worst of the leaks with thick, black tar. The work was hot and grueling under the afternoon sun, the acrid smell of the tar clinging to him, but with each sealed fissure, he felt a grim satisfaction. Inside, he turned his attention to the most dangerously bowed ceiling joist in the main reading room. Using a heavy-duty car jack from his garage and a length of salvaged lumber, he carefully braced it, the groan of the old wood under pressure sounding like a patient's sigh of relief. His next move was to establish a beachhead against the chaos. He chose 2 small, connected offices in the back, rooms that had been spared the worst of the water damage. He shoveled out years of debris, a mulch of sodden paper, fallen plaster, and filth. He used a crowbar to pry the rotting plywood from the windows, letting clean, honest light spill into the space for the first time in a decade. He scrubbed the floors on his hands and knees, the rhythmic scrape of his brush against the filthy linoleum a steady, determined beat. When he was done, the 2 rooms stood as a small, isolated pocket of order within the vast, surrounding decay. The air was clean, the floors were clear, and the light was bright. Looking from the clean space through the doorway into the ruined main hall was like looking from a lifeboat at a sinking ship. It was a start. A few days later, he ventured into the library's basement, a damp, subterranean space that smelled of earth, rust, and the cold stone of the foundation. He was looking for salvageable copper piping from the hulking, silent boiler that dominated the room, a metal beast sleeping in the gloom. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing over damp stone walls and cobwebs as thick as cotton. As he swept the light across a far corner, it caught the edge of a heavy wooden crate tucked beneath a moldy, stiff tarp. Curiosity piqued. He made his way over, his boots crunching on the gritty floor. The tarp came away with a dusty rip, revealing a simple, sturdy footlocker. He wedged the tip of his crowbar into the lid. The old wood groaned in protest, the screech of nails being pulled from their long slumber echoing in the enclosed space. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed, brittle straw, were dozens of reel-to-reel audio tapes. They were not thrown in haphazardly, but arranged in neat rows, each box meticulously labeled in an elegant, faded cursive script that spoke of a more patient time. He picked one up, his dirty fingers gentle on the fragile cardboard. He read the label aloud, his voice a low whisper in the silence of the tomb-like basement. Agnes Miller, midwife, 1972. He picked up another. Jedediah Stone, coal miner, 1975. And another. Sarah Jenkins, mill hand, 1968. The names were ghosts, familiar surnames from town folklore, from street signs, from the weathered gravestones in the Harmony Creek Cemetery. A profound sense of discovery washed over him, the electric thrill of an archaeologist stumbling upon a forgotten tomb. These weren't just objects, they were voices. They were the lost stories of this town, the quiet testimonies of lives lived and hardships endured. He felt an immediate, protective reverence for the crate and its precious contents. He carefully closed the lid, a new, more urgent purpose solidifying in his mind. He hadn't just been given a junkyard, he had been given a treasure chest. He had found the library's soul, packed away in a box, waiting in the dark. The work of resurrection began not in the hallowed, dusty halls of the library, but in the cramped, Spartan apartment above Liam's auto repair garage. The space was a reflection of his mind, cluttered but meticulously organized, with sockets and wrenches arranged by size on pegboards and technical manuals stacked in neat, towering piles. It smelled perpetually of oil, metal, and solvent, a scent so ingrained it clung to his clothes and skin like a second identity. On his small kitchen table, amidst schematics for a vintage carburetor, sat his new acquisitions, a dusty, second-hand reel-to-reel player he'd bought for $40 at a pawn shop, and a battered laptop borrowed from a client whose car he was fixing. He had chosen the first tape almost at random, drawn by the solid, earthy name, Jedediah Stone, coal miner, 1975. With the careful, steady hands of a surgeon, or a mechanic accustomed to threading wires through an engine block, Liam threaded the thin, brittle ribbon of tape through the machine's complex path of guides and heads. He pressed the stiff, clunky play button. For a long moment, there was only the soft whir of the reels and a sound like frying bacon, a hiss and crackle of pure, empty time. Then, a voice emerged from the static, a man's voice, deep and gravelly as the coal he once mined, a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the mountain itself. It filled the small apartment, a ghost in the machine. The voice told the harrowing story of the Harmony Creek mine collapse of 1958, a story Liam had only known as a headline on a yellowed newspaper clipping in the town's historical society. But this was different. Jedediah's voice painted the picture with terrifying immediacy. The suffocating, absolute darkness that swallowed the light from their helmets, the taste of rock dust on their tongues, the slow, agonizing dwindling of the air. He spoke of the hymns the trapped men sang to keep the fear at bay, their voices a fragile shield against the crushing weight of the earth above. As the story unfolded, a raw, living testimony, Liam methodically began the process of digitizing the audio. He had routed the player's output to the laptop's microphone jack, and his eyes were fixed on the electric green waveform growing across the screen, a visual representation of a dead man's words. He was completely mesmerized. This wasn't history from a book, dry and distant. It was a living thing, pulsing with fear and faith. He could almost feel the chill of the mine, smell the damp, cold earth, and hear the faint, ghostly chorus of men singing in the dark. An unexpected kinship bloomed in his chest, a connection across the decades to this man he'd never met. Jedediah was a man who worked with his hands in the dark, whose life and the lives of others depended on his skill, his nerve, and his knowledge of the complex, dangerous systems around him. Liam looked at his own hands, the grease and grime permanently etched into the lines of his palms, and felt a profound, humbling sense of recognition. He wasn't just saving a story, he was bearing witness. The silence of the library had begun to feel less like peace and more like a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of quiet. To make the long hours of sorting and cleaning less lonely, Liam brought a small, sleek Bluetooth speaker from his apartment and set it on the scarred circulation desk. He connected it to his laptop and, with a click, the vast, empty hall was filled with the amplified voice of Jedediah Stone. The miner's gravelly baritone echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, the story of the collapse now a public proclamation rather than a private confession. The sound, rich and strange, spilled out of the broken windows and open doors, a voice from the past calling out into the present. Outside, a group of teenagers, including Maya, were loitering near the library steps, their afternoon a familiar landscape of boredom and restless energy. They were planning some minor vandalism, a spray-painted tag on the back wall, something to leave a mark to prove they existed. Then they heard it, the disembodied voice rolling out of the derelict building. They froze, their conversation dying. "Dude, what is that?" One of the teens, a lanky boy named Kyle, whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at the dark maw of the library entrance. "Sounds like a ghost," Maya muttered, though her tone held more intrigue than fear. A dare was issued, a challenge to their collective courage. They crept closer, moving with the cautious, silent steps of urban explorers venturing into forbidden territory. They peered through a grimy, broken window pane, expecting to find a squatter with a radio, or perhaps some elaborate prank. The sight that met their eyes was far more confusing. There was Liam, the town mechanic, a man they recognized but had never really seen, methodically sorting through a pile of salvageable books. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, seemingly oblivious to their presence, while this powerful, haunting story of survival and death filled the air around him. There was no malice in the scene, no threat, just a man working and a voice telling a story. The teenagers exchanged baffled glances, their desire for mischief evaporating, replaced by a potent, unsettling curiosity. They lingered for several minutes, hidden in the shadows, listening to a piece of their town's history they had never known. When they finally retreated, melting back into the afternoon, the miner's story followed them, a lingering echo in the quiet streets. A few days later, that echo brought an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Vance, a formidable retired English teacher in her 70s, marched up the library steps, her back ramrod straight and her face set with the righteous indignation of a woman on a mission. She was known throughout Harmony Creek for her sharp tongue and an even sharper intellect, a guardian of grammar and syntax who saw the world in terms of well-structured paragraphs. In her mind, a vagrant had taken over her beloved, albeit dead, institution, and she was fully prepared to deliver a lecture on trespassing, civic duty, and the proper care of public property that would leave the offender reeling. She pushed the heavy door open and stopped abruptly just inside the threshold, her prepared speech dying on her lips. The voice of a woman, warm and clear, was playing from Liam's speaker, recounting the story of the Great Blizzard of 1963, of delivering a baby by candlelight while the snow piled up past the windows. Eleanor's stern, angry expression melted away, replaced by a look of stunned, profound recognition. "Agnes," she whispered, her voice suddenly thick with unshed tears. She took a shaky step forward, her hand rising to her mouth. "She delivered me." Her sharp, intelligent eyes, now glistening, turned on Liam, who had been startled by her sudden, forceful entrance. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice regaining some of its familiar authority, but now laced with a raw, vulnerable edge. Liam, unused to being the center of such intense scrutiny, haltingly explained his discovery in the basement, the crate of tapes, the forgotten voices. Eleanor's gaze, which missed nothing, swept over the cavernous room, taking in the piles of debris, the water-stained walls, the general chaos. Then her eyes landed on the two clean rooms in the back, the neatly stacked piles of salvageable books, and finally, on Liam's earnest, grease-stained face. "You're making a mess of it?" she declared, and for a second, Liam's heart sank. But her tone lacked its usual acidic bite. It was a statement of fact, not a condemnation. These books need to be cataloged, not just piled. They have an order, an entire system. She pointed a long, elegant finger at a stack of novels. "I will help you," she announced, the words hanging in the air like a royal decree. "But on one condition." She fixed him with a gaze that was both fierce and pleading. "You keep playing these tapes, every single one." In that moment, a crucial alliance was forged. Liam, the man of practical skills, of engines and structures, had found his counterpart in Eleanor, the woman of words and order. He was no longer alone in his strange, self-appointed task. Her validation, her immediate and total understanding of the tape's intrinsic importance, was a balm to his solitary efforts. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. News of the ghost voices at the library began to spread through the town's invisible, highly efficient gossip network. It started as a curiosity, a strange tale about the town mechanic and his haunted library. The first to venture in were a few curious seniors, drawn by the names they heard whispered in the aisles of the grocery store. Liam, sensing a shift, had cleaned a few of the old wooden chairs and set them up in the main reading room. An old man with a cane, Mr. Abernathy, who had owned the hardware store for 50 years, sat down one afternoon. He listened, his head bowed, as the voice of his father's best friend, A man lost in the same mine collapse that Jedediah Stone had survived, described their last fishing trip together. Tears rolled down the old man's weathered cheeks, silent and unchecked. He stayed for an hour and left without a word, but he was back the next day, and he brought a friend. The teenagers returned, too, but not as a pack, not with the loud bravado of their first visit. They came in twos and threes or sometimes alone. They didn't talk. They would find a corner, a spot on the floor, or one of the dusty chairs, and they would just listen, their faces illuminated by the screens of their phones, which now lay forgotten in their laps. Then, a significant event happened, a quiet turning point. Kyle, the lanky boy from the initial group of would-be vandals, shuffled up to the makeshift desk where Liam and Eleanor were now working, a strange partnership of grease and grammar. He avoided eye contact, his gaze fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched. He placed a faded, well-worn copy of The Hobbit on the desk between them. "Found this under my bed," Kyle mumbled, his face burning with a deep, adolescent embarrassment. "It's, overdue. By about 6 years." He turned and practically fled before Eleanor could say a word, his sneakers squeaking on the dusty floor as he made his escape. Eleanor looked at the book, then at Liam, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. The atmosphere in the library was changing, subtly but undeniably. The dominant, cloying smell of decay and mildew was now mingled with the sharp, clean scent of the lemon polish Eleanor had brought from home, and the faint, comforting aroma of coffee from the thermos Liam now brought every day. The soundscape was becoming layered, complex. Beneath the crackle and hiss of the old recordings, there was now the soft shuffle of feet, a hushed cough, the quiet, rhythmic turning of a page. The Harmony Creek Library was breathing again, its shallow, ragged breaths growing stronger with each new voice, each new listener, each overdue book returned from the wilderness. The two small, dry rooms, once a lonely outpost of order, were now transforming into the functional, albeit rustic, heart of a nascent library. A new rhythm had taken hold, a syncopation of determined effort. Eleanor, in her absolute element, orchestrated the cataloging process with the precision of a seasoned general deploying her troops. She had enlisted Maya and 2 of her friends, a girl named Chloe and the now-reformed Kyle, who seemed to find a quiet purpose in the meticulous work. With a stack of donated index cards and a collection of fine-tipped pens, Eleanor taught them the elegant logic of the Dewey Decimal System. They created handmade library cards, their youthful handwriting a stark, hopeful contrast to the faded, spidery script on the reel-to-reel boxes. While Eleanor managed what she called the library's software, Liam focused on its hardware. Using lumber salvaged from collapsed shelving and other parts of the ruin, he built sturdy, if unrefined, bookshelves that smelled of fresh-cut pine. They were not beautiful, but they were strong, and they stood straight and true. He spent a frustrating but ultimately triumphant day wrestling with the ancient plumbing, managing to get one of the toilets functional again, a victory that felt as significant as patching the roof. He then carefully rewired a section of the main room, running new conduit and installing safe, modern outlets and a string of warm, bright work lights, banishing the gloomy shadows to the far corners. The project developed a life of its own, drawing people in. A local baker, a stout, flower-dusted man whose grandmother's gentle voice was on a tape describing her victory garden during the war, began dropping off a large box of pastries every morning. The sweet, yeasty smell of fresh bread and cinnamon now mingled with the scent of old paper and lemon polish, a fragrant testament to the growing community spirit. Eleanor, tapping a worn copy of a novel with the end of her pen, corrected Maya gently. "No, my dear, American fiction is 813. You've put it in ancient history alongside the Romans. This isn't just about numbers on a spine," she explained, her voice patient but firm. "This is the architecture of human thought, a map of our collective imagination. Give it the respect it deserves." A month ago, Maya would have met such a lecture with a sullen eye roll. Now, she listened with an almost reverent intensity. She carefully took the book and walked to the correct, newly built shelf, her movements deliberate. She was finding a purpose here that felt more real, more tangible, than anything she had ever learned in a classroom. She was not just shelving a book, she was helping to rebuild a world. As the small library began to take shape, Liam turned his attention back to the boiler room, which he was slowly clearing to create a proper workshop for himself. While moving the last of the junk, a pile of rusted metal and rotted canvas, he discovered a smaller, tin box he had previously overlooked, tucked away in the dark recess behind the boiler itself. It was not a simple footlocker like the first one, but a heavy, soldered document box, the kind used to protect important papers from fire. It took him 20 minutes with a hammer and a cold chisel to carefully break the seal. This box contained more than just tapes. It held leather-bound journals, stacks of faded photographs tied with twine, and bundles of letters, their paper as thin and fragile as a dragonfly's wing. As he carefully leafed through the contents, a thrill ran through him. Many of the letters and journal entries corresponded directly to the audio recordings he had been digitizing. He found a photograph of a young Jedediah Stone, his face clean and smiling, standing with his arm around a woman, a stark contrast to the weary, gravelly voice on the tape. One journal, its cover embossed with the name of the library's first librarian from the 1940s, contained a cryptic, tantalizing entry. He read the elegant script under the bare bulb of his work light. With the threat of war, the committee has agreed. The charter, our town's very soul, must be protected from any calamity, especially fire. It is now safe, hidden away behind the heart of the building, until a time of peace returns. The time capsule, the original town charter, hidden somewhere within these walls. Just as this new, electrifying possibility emerged, a cold shadow fell across the doorway. The old threat had returned. Mayor Henderson stood there, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the dusty boiler room. He had heard about the growing, unauthorized assembly at the library, and his face was a mask of cold fury. His eyes swept past Liam, taking in the people, the new shelves, the hum of quiet activity filtering down from the rooms above. He saw not a community triumph, but a massive, uninsured liability. "The fun is over, Liam," Henderson said, his voice as cold and final as a slamming door. "This is a clear violation of a dozen city codes. Health, safety, fire regulations. I can't even begin to list them." He took a step into the room, his polished shoes leaving clean prints in the dust. "We're putting a permanent fence around the entire property at the end of the week. It's for the town's safety." He looked past Liam, his gaze dismissing the entire enterprise. "And yours, Eleanor." When Liam told her the news, became a whirlwind of righteous fury. Her anger was not hot and explosive, but cold, dense, and incredibly focused. She spent the next 2 days on the phone, her voice a low, urgent hum. She called every person who had come to the library, every senior who had shed a tear listening to a lost voice, every parent whose child had found a quiet corner to read. She called the baker, Mr. Abernathy from the hardware store, and the families of Maya, Chloe, and Kyle. The result was that on the night of the next Harmony Creek Town Council meeting, the drab, wood-paneled room, usually populated by a handful of board officials and a lone reporter, was packed to the rafters. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. The air was thick with anticipation. When the floor was opened for public comment, Eleanor was the first to the podium. She looked small and frail behind the heavy wooden lectern, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. Instead of launching into the tirade the council members were clearly expecting, she simply nodded to Liam, who was standing by the wall with his laptop and the small Bluetooth speaker. He pressed a key. A woman's voice, clear and proud despite the crackle of age, filled the room. It was the recorded voice of the town founder's great-granddaughter, taken from a tape dated 1978. She spoke of the spirit of community that had built Harmony Creek from nothing but wilderness and determination, of neighbors raising a barn together, of sharing what little they had to survive the first harsh winter. The voice from the past held the room spellbound. When the recording finished, a profound silence lingered. Then an elderly man, Mr. Abernathy, slowly stood up from his seat in the front row, leaning heavily on his cane. My father's best friend was Jedediah Stone, he said, his own voice trembling with emotion. He died in that mine. I haven't heard his voice in 50 years. This library, he said, pointing a shaky finger towards the door, as if the building itself were just outside, gave that back to me. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Maya, her face pale but her eyes bright with conviction, walked to the podium. She clutched a piece of paper in her hands, but she didn't look at it. I used to think this town was boring, she began, her voice shaking but clear, gathering strength with every word. Just a bunch of old buildings and old people. But it's not. It has stories. We have stories. And they're in that library. She looked directly at Mayor Henderson, her fear replaced by a sudden, fierce clarity. You can't put a fence around our own history. The council members, including Henderson, were visibly stunned. They had been prepared for Eleanor's predictable, grammatically perfect anger. They were not prepared for this, for a ghost's testimony, for an old man's tears, for a teenage girl's passionate, unscripted defense of her home. They were faced not with a liability issue, but with a passionate, multi-generational constituency that had found its voice. The council, caught completely off guard and facing a room full of determined voters, agreed to a temporary stay of execution. The fence was postponed. A wave of triumphant murmurs swept through the crowd. But the victory was short-lived. The mayor, recovering his composure, laid out the terms. The stay was conditional. They would have to submit a formal proposal for the library's reopening. A real one, he'd said, his tone laced with condescension. The proposal had to include a detailed 5-year operational budget, proof of comprehensive liability insurance, a formal board of directors, and a complete structural assessment from a certified engineer. The small group of library supporters stood on the steps of the town hall after the meeting, the cool night air doing little to quell the heat of their earlier passion. The initial, heady feeling of victory was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the crushing, tangible weight of the new task. It was a mountain of bureaucracy, designed to be impossible to climb. Liam felt a familiar cold dread seep into his bones, the old, ingrained feeling of the outcast. He could fix a busted transmission with his eyes closed. He could diagnose a building's weaknesses and brace its tired bones. He could even, with patience, resurrect the voices of the dead. But he couldn't write a budget. He didn't know the first thing about navigating the labyrinth of municipal politics or insurance underwriting. He felt the trust that these people, his newfound friends, had placed in him begin to feel like a lead weight in his stomach. He was out of his depth, a mechanic trying to perform brain surgery, and he was destined to fail them all. He stared out at the quiet town square, the library a dark, silent shape across the street, and felt the entire project slipping through his fingers. Just as the despair threatened to swallow him whole, he felt a firm, steady hand on his arm. He turned to see Eleanor standing beside him, her face illuminated by the streetlights, her expression fierce and unyielding. "Don't you dare shut down now, Liam," she said, her voice low and intense, a steel blade wrapped in velvet. "We will do this the same way you fixed that roof." She looked from his face to the dark library and back again, her eyes boring into his. "One joist, one shingle, one line item at a time. We will build it." The mayor's challenge, intended to be a bureaucratic guillotine, had instead become a forge. It galvanized the quiet, scattered affection for the library into a single, determined force. The main reading room, dark and silent for a decade, was transformed into a vibrant, chaotic command center that hummed with energy late into the night. The challenge, meant to crush them, had given them a common enemy and a shared purpose. The community, a loose collection of individuals, rallied in a way no one, least of all Mayor Henderson, thought possible. Arthur Pennington, a retired accountant who had been deeply moved by a tape of his third-grade teacher reading a poem, volunteered to create the budget. He sat at a folding table, a small desk lamp illuminating his meticulous figures, turning a mountain of receipts and estimates into a coherent financial plan. A young lawyer named Sarah Chun, who had recently moved back to Harmony Creek to care for her aging father, offered to handle all the legal paperwork pro bono. She saw in the library's revival a reason to believe in the town she had once been so eager to escape. Maya and her friends, now the library's most passionate youth advocates, organized a weekend car wash and bake sale in the parking lot of the grocery store. They made signs with brightly colored markers, their youthful enthusiasm infectious. They washed cars with a joyful fervor, soaking each other with the hose, while the smell of brownies and lemon pound cake, baked by half the grandmothers in town, filled the air. At the end of the weekend, they presented Eleanor with a crumpled, soap-spotted cash box containing $942. It was a symbolic amount, a pittance against the projected costs, but it was the most meaningful money any of them had ever earned. It was an investment, a down payment on their own future. Every night for a week, the newly formed, unofficial board of directors worked late, fueled by endless pots of coffee brewed on a hot plate and the baker's seemingly inexhaustible supply of pastries. Liam, Eleanor, Arthur, and Sarah huddled around a large table, their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple laptop screens. The scene was a collage of determined energy, a study in collaborative hope. The sharp scent of fresh coffee mingled with the comforting aroma of old books and the faint, sweet perfume of the baker's donations. The low, urgent murmur of their voices, debating line items and legal clauses, replaced the ghostly silence. On a large whiteboard Liam had salvaged and erected, they scribbled notes and diagrams, their frantic handwriting mapping out the library's path back to life. On the final night before the proposal was due, as Sarah was printing the final documents, Liam felt a surge of empowerment. He took a pen and, in his own, surprisingly neat block lettering, added a new section to the proposal's appendix, a section titled Potential Cultural and Economic Impact. In it, he described the cryptic clue from the old librarian's journal, framing the potential discovery of the original town charter not as a wild goose chase, but as a future tourist attraction, a tangible piece of history that could draw visitors and revenue to Harmony Creek. It was a long shot, but for the first time he felt like he was playing their game, using their language, and it felt good. The shared sense of purpose was a tangible force in the room, a warmth that pushed back against the cavernous dark. While the town council deliberated, a heavy, anxious silence fell over the library's small band of saviors. The proposal was submitted, a thick stack of paper representing a week of sleepless nights and a town's collective hope. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. Liam, however, was not built for waiting. The nervous energy that had fueled their late-night sessions now churned inside him with no outlet. He couldn't stand the quiet, the feeling of their fate being decided behind closed doors by men who saw only risk and liability. He needed to do something to push forward. He found the old librarian's journal, its leather cover soft and worn beneath his fingers, and read the entry again. Hidden away behind the heart of the building. The phrase had echoed in his mind for days. He had walked the building from top to bottom, his mechanic's mind trying to diagnose the riddle. The boiler? No, that was the building's gut. The circulation desk? The hands, perhaps. Then it struck him, a simple, obvious answer he had overlooked. The heart of any old home, the center of its life and warmth, was its hearth. His gaze fell upon the grand, soot-stained stone fireplace that dominated the main reading room, a magnificent structure of river rock and heavy oak that had not seen a fire in decades. With a small crowd of his new allies, Eleanor, Maya, Kyle, and Arthur, watching in tense silence, he began to act on his hunch. He started by tapping the plaster wall next to the massive stone mantelpiece, his knuckles rapping gently against the surface. He moved slowly, methodically, his ear close to the wall, listening. Tap, tap, thud, tap, tap, thud. Then, about 3 feet to the right of the firebox, he heard it, a subtle but distinct change in pitch. Tap, tap, thrum. A hollow sound. A collective, indrawn breath went through the small group. This was it. This was either the moment their hopes were validated or the moment he looked like a fool. Using a hammer and a cold chisel with the surgical precision he usually reserved for delicate engine work, he began to carefully chip away at the plaster. White dust filled the air. Beneath the plaster, he found not lath, but a solid layer of old, red bricks, laid in a different pattern from the surrounding wall. It was a patch, a deliberate seal. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the steady, rhythmic chip, chip, chip of his chisel. He carefully removed one brick, then another, creating a small, dark opening. He shone his flashlight inside. The beam caught the dull gleam of metal. A collective gasp, a single sound of shared astonishment, echoed in the high-ceilinged room. He reached into the dark void, his fingers brushing against a cold, smooth surface. He carefully worked the object free. It was a small, heavy, lead-lined box, its surface dark with the patina of age. He placed it gently on the floor, the silence in the room now absolute. With the tip of the chisel, he pried open the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded, threadbare velvet, was the original handwritten Harmony Creek Town Charter from the 1880s, its ink still dark and clear on the thick, creamy parchment. Alongside it lay a few other artifacts, a first-edition book of poetry by a local author, its pages crisp and untouched, and a sepia-toned photograph of the library's first staff, a group of serious-looking men and women standing proudly on the very steps outside. It was real. It was all real. It was undeniable, tangible proof of the library's central place in the town's history. A treasure hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally listen to the walls. The discovery of the charter changed everything. It was no longer a story about a group of well-meaning citizens trying to save a derelict building. It was a story about uncovering the town's own birth certificate. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with a picture of Liam holding the open box, his face a mixture of shock and awe. The story was picked up by a regional news station. Suddenly, the Harmony Creek Library was not a local issue. It was a piece of state history. The town council, facing a wave of public pride and media attention, had no choice but to unanimously approve the proposal. The grand reopening was set for a sunny Saturday afternoon. The entire town seemed to have turned out. The street in front of the library was blocked off, and a festive, almost giddy atmosphere filled the air. The building itself was far from perfect. The roof was still a patchwork of old slate and new tar, and the paint on the eaves was faded and peeling, but the windows were scrubbed clean and sparkled in the sun. The wide stone steps were swept, and a beautiful hand-painted sign hung above the door, its elegant letters proclaiming, Harmony Creek Community Library. Mayor Henderson, ever the opportunist, was front and center, his smile wide and artificial. He held a giant pair of ceremonial scissors, ready to cut the ribbon and claim the victory as his own bold initiative for historic preservation. He gave a short, pompous speech about vision and community investment, the words hollow and self-serving. When he finished, he gestured for the ribbon to be cut, but a voice from the crowd shouted, "Let Liam do it!" The call was picked up by others, a growing chorus of voices that swelled into a unified chant. Liam! 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 The crowd parted, pushing Liam forward, much to his visible discomfort. He was a man who preferred the quiet company of machines, not the adoring gaze of a crowd. Someone handed him a microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces, a dizzying mix of old friends and new allies, of people he had known his whole life who were seeing him for the first time, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced at the note card someone had pressed into his hand, a few polite, prepared remarks, and knew he couldn't read them. They weren't his words. Instead, his eyes found the small box on the podium containing one of the original reel-to-reel tapes. He picked it up, holding it in his palm. Liam's voice was quiet when he spoke, but the microphone carried it clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. "This place was never really dead," he said, his voice steady and clear, gaining confidence as he spoke the truth. "It was just quiet." He held up the tape for everyone to see, the thin brown ribbon holding a man's life story. The stories, the town's real stories, were always here, waiting in the dark. We just had to learn how to listen again. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him, seeing not a crowd, but a community. He then turned and gestured with the tape toward the wide-open doors behind him. "Welcome back to your library." He didn't cut the ribbon. He simply stepped aside, and the crowd, with a joyful cheer, surged forward, the symbolic barrier forgotten as they reclaimed their history. The crowd flooded in, but it was not with the hushed, reverent silence of a traditional library. It was a joyful, buzzing hub of activity, a celebration of return. The air hummed with conversation and laughter, the sound of a community coming home. In one corner, near the bright, clean windows, a children's story hour was already underway. A young mother, one of the volunteers from the bake sale, sat in a rocking chair, reading aloud to a circle of captivated children. The listening station Liam had built, a long wooden bench with multiple sets of headphones connected to a series of digital audio players, had a line of people of all ages. A teenage boy with headphones pressed to his ears laughed aloud, while an elderly woman next to him wiped a tear from her eye, each of them lost in a different voice, a different time. Eleanor was at the new checkout desk, a sturdy, polished counter Liam had built from salvaged oak. Her face, usually set in a stern, academic expression, was absolutely beaming as she firmly stamped the due date card of a book for a young girl. The solid thud of the stamp a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. Maya was confidently reshelving a cart of returned books, her movements efficient and sure. She paused to patiently show a younger boy how the cataloging system worked, her voice, once sharp with teenage cynicism, now filled with a quiet, authoritative pride. Liam moved through the crowd, an anonymous, contented smile on his face. He was just an observer now, watching the intricate, beautiful machine he had helped to build spring to life. He saw Mr. Abernathy showing his grandson a picture in a history book, pointing to a face and whispering a story. He saw the baker laughing with Sarah Chun near the pastry-laden refreshment table. He was a part of it all, yet apart from it, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He slipped away from the main room, the happy noise fading behind him, and went down to his workshop in the boiler room. The space was his sanctuary, clean, orderly, and quiet. He sat at his workbench and looked at the rows of digitized audio files on his laptop, a vast, invisible library of voices he had saved from the silence. He hadn't bought the library. The city had given it to him as a burden, a problem to be managed. But in shouldering that burden, he had uncovered its soul. The lost voices had not only brought the town back together, they had given him, the outcast mechanic, a home and a purpose he never knew he was looking for. He was no longer just the man who fixed things that were broken. He was the man who had helped the town remember itself. The final shot is of Liam, leaning against the doorway of his workshop, a genuine, peaceful smile on his face. The vibrant, living sound of the community in the room above blended with the faint, imagined echo of Jedediah Stone's gravelly voice, a perfect, seamless harmony of past and present. The library's heart was beating strong, and he was the one who had found its rhythm.